Namaste everyone. So we are covering this book, The India That Is Bharat, written by J. Sai Deepak. So far this is part four. So far we have covered three parts of this series. So in the first part, I had read the introduction, and as we all know that the book is divided into three sections. That is section one about coloniality, section two civilization, and section three constitution. So I have covered two chapters of the first section, that is coloniality, and first chapter was colonization, colonialism, coloniality, and decoloniality, language matters. Second chapter was the discovery of coloniality and the birth of decoloniality. So I'm going to cover the third chapter in today's video, that is coloniality, indigenous faiths, nature, and knowledge. So let us start on with the third chapter and part four of this book, of this series, that is this book, India That Is Bharat, written by J. Sai Deepak. So let us start with the third chapter that starts from page 60 of this book. So let us see what this chapter is going to say about mm, the myths that it is going to break. So let us see. The most studies on European colonialism are typically centered around its impact on political independence of colonized native societies, the immense economic harm caused to them, and the consequent illiteracy and impoverishment of these societies. In my opinion, this in itself is a proof of coloniality, since quite a few native societies are yet to understand the true impact of colonialism, namely the loss of an original indigenous perspective, which does not even seem to figure in their list of things to reclaim. To restate, if a colonized society assesses even the loss it has suffered on account of colonialism on the anvils of development as defined by the European colonizer, it only proves the entrenchment of coloniality. In fact, it firmly establishes the extent of internationalization of the colonial worldview deep within the native society's consciousness. So much so that it is oblivious to the loss of its own agency over such consciousness. After all, how can one feel the loss of a thing whose existence one has become unconscious to? While it is easy to dismiss this as an elitism of the well fed, the exhortation is not about obsessing over the loss of high culture while the masses are left to deal with the soul crushing poverty. Instead, it is about restoring something as fundamental as dignity to the native perspective so that the indigenous society can rebuild itself using its own ideas and tools instead of those of the colonizer. Fortunately, there exists scholarship which avoids the predictable, superficial, and mercantile lines of inquiry in relation to the impact of European colonialism, and delves deeper by examining the very character of the economic growth which has been universalized by the European colonizer at the expense of nature. So scholars agree that apart from wiping out entire civilizations, restructuring economies, and redrawing the map of the world, European colonialism's deadliest consequence for the entire world has been its fundamental conceptual alteration of the relationship between human beings and nature. In short, the introduction of humanism and its relationship with the materialism, consumerism can be traced to European coloniality. In stark contrast to the benevolent connotations imputed to humanism, the literature reveals, as we shall see, that it has the direct effect on placing humans over and above nature, which is the product of coloniality. The monumental shift in the approach to nature affected indigenous. This is an important thing that we should note down. That the literature reveals that it has the direct effect of placing humans over and above nature, which is the product of coloniality. This monumental shift in the approach to nature affected indigenous societies the most, since prior to European colonization, the entirety of their culture was is inextricably linked to and revolved around nature, including their faith system, sense of common community, systems of production and dissemination of knowledge and economy. For instance, the Native Americans believed that life emerged from the interior of the earth. Native Americans believed that life emerged from the interior of the earth, and the earth resembled the womb of a mother in which she nurtured life. Prior to the advent of European colonizer, the belief formed the basis of fraternal relation between various tribes as well as between communities and their respective geographies. The end result, or perhaps the objective, was to preserve respect for nature and its balance. That a fraternal bond existed between diverse communities, which are often lumped together as indigenous peoples, is clear from the fact that when the European colonizer arrived in North America, there were close to 2,000 cultural groups and had their own lifestyles, languages, beliefs, and customs. Notwithstanding territorial conflicts, which may be attributed to human nature, their coexistence has been attributed to their human to land ethic and their belief that they were all citizens of nature. This ability to think as a species that is not removed from nature and to simultaneously preserve and celebrate the cultural diversity within is of immense relevance to several contemporary debates where discussions around social cohesion and unity are loaded with an overbearing penchant for homogenization and standardization. In his book, The Spiritual Legacy of the American Indian, Joseph Epps Brown, a scholar of Native American tradition, observed that despite their diversity, the Amerindian peoples lived in a metaphysic of nature wherein each group spelled out in great detail the roles and responsibilities of the members of the community. This enumeration of roles was based on the realization of the vast web of humankind's cyclical interrelationship with the elements, the earth, and all that lives upon the land. Their relationship with the earth was one of the reciprocal appropriation, that is, to give and receive, in which humans participate in the landscape, while at the same time they incorporate the landscape and its inhabitants into the most fundamental human experience and understanding. To them, nature was never meant to be isolated from humans and studied in a silo, as opposed to being in an object of a clinical study. It was meant to be lived within harmony. This environmental morality instilled humility and informed both inter-community relations as well as their collective relationship with nature. The ethical relationship with nature was based on the fundamental belief that there was a spiritual dimension to the earth, of which humans too were a part, but only a part, and it was believed that upsetting the balance of nature would not go unpunished by it. Their natives the natives respect for nature gave rise to their faith, and the symbols or icons used were inspired by animals and landforms, thereby putting nature at the center of their lives. Connections among members of the community were forged through specific traditions. Even their epistemology revolved around nature and communal harmony. It was this deeply spiritual relationship embodied in traditional practices and oral knowledge of tribe elders that constitute their religion, thus trying together nature, faith, and knowledge. On a related note, perhaps followers of certain Indic schools of philosophy can relate to the beliefs of the Sion culture as depicted by Brown in his book The Sacred Pipe. The Sion people believed that the whole of creation was essentially one, and that all parts within the whole were related. What was particularly interesting was the way the Sioux referred to each other in relational terms. For instance, an old woman would be addressed as mother, and a much older woman as grandmother. Such an approach to human relation is a direct corollary of the community's spiritual attitude to nature. All of this changed when Columbus' Christian Expeditionary Party landed on the shores of America with an intention to colonize it. When the European colonizer set foot on the American soil, he was staunchly rooted in the Christian belief that the humans were above other creatures, since humans were beings because they possessed souls, and the rest were non-beings because they had no souls. Christianity placed the human beings, preferably the Christian white European, above the rest of creation, thereby furthering the belief that nature existed solely for the pursuit of its happiness and his manifest destiny. The difference in the attitudes of the Native American and the colonizer towards nature could not have been starker. One worshipped nature and saw himself as a part of it, while the other put himself above nature and sought to enjoy its plenty as a matter of divinely ordained right. It is no surprise that humanism and materialism are the direct consequences of the colonizers' OET, which, among other things, gave birth to a Cartesian dualistic approach whose distinction between subject mind and object body placed human beings above nature. This explains the colonizers' approach to development as well. Simply put, coloniality objectified nature apart from dehumanizing vast swathes of humanity. So it is page number 64, the last paragraph. Interestingly, while the Enlightenment is celebrated for ushering in the age of reason through its supposed challenges to Christian dogma, it is Enlightenment whose emphasis on Christianity's Cartesian dualistic approach to humans and nature that advanced the idea of superiority of the rational human mind over non rational nature. This paved the way for the conquest of nature by the superior human. Nature was reduced to a commodity, the knowledge of which was necessary not to live with or in it, but for the utilization of natural resources. Richard Drayton in Nature's Government argued that the commodification of nature was driving force behind imperialism and colonialism, which gave birth to capitalism and universalist developmentalism. This is because to the Christian European colonizer, the rest of the world represented wildness, and so he took it upon himself to civilize population and subdue nature by introducing them to rationality and order. This civilizing mission took the form of aggressive industrialization and spawned the development discourse which dominated the 20th century and continues to have contemporary purchase in the several decolonized countries that are still trying to catch up with the West. Critically, despite the diversity of human experiences and natural conditions encountered by the colonizer in different parts of the world, he was convinced beyond doubt that the same model of economic growth, industrialization, and development could be replicated uniformly across the world without exception. This once again reflects the homogenizing intent and effect of the modernity rationality complex of the European coloniality. Raymond Murphy went so far as to say that control over nature and its utilization as a resource may have been shaped the European colonizers' ideas of government, empire, and economics, since the goal was to govern all of nature. It has been posited that the very idea of rationality and its dimensions may have been consequence of the intention to explore, exploit, and govern nature in a systematic fashion, so much so that colonialism had been called the outworking of bureaucratic rationalization. Murphy argued that four dimensions of rationality became the central features of the colonial states, which have been identified as follows. Number one, so this is given on page number 65. So these are the four dimension. So number one is the development of science and technology, which has been defined as the calculated systematic expansion of the means to understand and manipulate nature. And the scientific worldviews belief in the mastery of nature and of humans through increased scientific and technical knowledge. Number two is the expansion of the capitalist economy with its rationally organized and in turn organizing market. Number three, formal hierarchical organization, namely the creation of executive government translating social action into rationally organized action. And number four, the elaboration of a formal legal system to manage social conflict and promote the predictability and calculability of the consequences of social action. So, to these four dimensions, I would add two more, that is five. Rejection of any onto epistemological system that worship nature instead of conquering and harnessing it, which led to either Christianity being imposed on the natives or in some cases Christianizing the native faith. And six, replacement of indigenous education system and systems of production of knowledge with a Christian European model of education, which embodied the first five dimensions deep within the native citizens of a colonized future and shaped their entire worldview. Murphy led the blame of the radical uncoupling of the cultural and the social form from nature at the doors of the Enlightenment, which he believed spurred the colonial project of reordering nature to serve human needs. This perhaps explains why the colonized territory was primarily viewed as a resource for exploitation, which its inhabitants being treated as subhuman, dark, idol worshipping, soulless heathen irritants who obstructed the colonizers' unhindered use of nature. Naturally, such an approach wreaked havoc on indigenous lands so much so that even the colonizer was alarmed and had to start thinking about conservation of nature. However, since the colonizer's mind was very fond of coloniality, his approach to conversation too was colonial because the silo based approach to human beings and the nature continued to plague his new mission of conserving nature. The modern, rational, scientific Christian European colonizer could not get himself to acknowledge that he lived experience and traditional knowledge of native societies gathered over millennia could teach him more than a thing or two about living in harmony with nature, as opposed to merely salvaging that what remained of it in the name of sustainable development. It took him ages to even concede that there was something seriously amiss in his attitude to nature, by which the time nature had started reacting to the plunder and devastation it had been subjected to. Apart from wreaking unprecedented havoc on nature and wiping out a native faith system, the presence of colonizer also had a direct bearing on native knowledge traditions, because, as stated earlier, such traditions were tied to the native faith. Such traditions were tied to the native faith, which was in turn rooted in nature. So, native knowledge traditions were largely passed on through the generations orally, employing storytelling as a means of transmitting knowledge. One of its objective was to keep the knowledge within the community so that it is accessible only to those who understood both its meaning and, importantly, its sanctity. This obviated the need for written records. However, the fundamental differences in their ontologies, coupled with the absence of written records, the importance given to the written word by the Christian colonizer, and the consequent treatment of the oral tradition as apocryphal and mythical, may collectively explain the colonizer's attitude to indigenous onto epistemological systems. For all its expression of iconoclasm towards polytheistic and idol worshipping indigenous communities, the religion of the European colonizer defies its central scripture as the word of God, given its revelatory treatment. Therefore, only that which was contained in their scripture or the book was deemed to be true, making the colonizers the people of the book. The expectation that every religion must have a book as its sole authority that captured its tenets was essentially a Christian expectation which was imposed onto epistemological system of native communities in order to delegitimize the or Christianize their faiths. The absence of a book not only rendered their faiths but also their entire history legendary and mythical in the eyes of the colonizer. Simply put, if the proof of the object of faith did not exist in writing, the object did not exist. The result was that instead of faith being treated as an experiential path to the divine, its validity had been established in the eyes of a colonizer who was intent on judging indigenous faith system on Christian European anvils of modernity and rationality. The absence of written records made it more convenient for the colonizer to erase native histories after destroying or appropriating their sacred spaces in an age prior to globalization, since the rest of the world did not know much about native culture before the advent of European colonizer. Thenceforth, their story would be the one written by the colonizer. In any case, given that close to 90% of the native population was wiped out in several colonized societies, such as the Americas, it had a direct impact on the continuity of their onto epistemological traditions and systems. This only added to their apocryphal aura that European colonialism had enveloped uh, enveloped native cultures in. Apart from the calculated use of violence, the colonizer introduced linguistic and educational policies intended to ensure that the native population that survived genocide was recast in the colonial mold. The Christian colonizer was acutely alive to the fact that that language captured a culture's journey and reflected it through its stories, idioms, proverbs, and usages, which connected the speaker with the collective past. To remove traces of the past in the language of the future, native children were forbidden from speaking in their languages, a practice that continues in the English medium schools to this day. Children were separated from their families and placed in a boarding schools to eliminate the influence of parents and their culture. This way, a modern Christian education created an entire generation of colonized Native Americans divorced from their heritage with no sense of belonging to their roots or even their family. Critically, a divide has been created within the members of the same family and community, and the only culture the future of the community was exposed to was that of the colonizer. So the locations of these boarding schools were chosen to further the goal of the cultural distancing by situating them as far away as possible from the cultural centers of the native society, and the medium of instruction was the language of the colonizer, either Portuguese, Spanish, French, or English. Unfortunately for the colonizer, traces of the native culture survived, albeit in the colonizer's language, but with that, the essence and the lived experience of the culture was altered forever. While while some scholars have interpreted the use of the colonizer's language to keep the native culture alive as a form of creative resistance on the part of indigenous colonized communities, in my view, such an interpretation is at best human optimism at work. Until natives fully reclaim their agency, which includes linguistic agency, there is no escaping the fact that they lead incomplete, inchoate, and incoherent lives individually and collectively. The colonial intent behind linguistic policies was equally reflective of the entire system of colonial education. Colonial education was offered not as an alternative to pre existing indigenous forms of education but with the specific objective of gradually erasing their existence. The literature on the African experience was The literature on the African experience with colonial education introduced by the British, especially in South Africa, tells us that colonial investment in education, the colonized population had several motivations, religious not excluded, wherein the modernity rationality complex played a significant role. The colonizer's perceived sense of religious and racial superiority meant that he felt obligated to civilize and educate the indigenous population and liberate indigenous souls from the ignorance and superstition that possessed them. In this sense, colonial education was a form of exorcism performed on the heathen native by by the Christian colonizer. That apart, the more mundane and practical consideration that was couched in loftier otherworldly objectives was the need to cultivate loyalty towards the colonizing empire in the short term and lay the foundation for the long term co-option and assimilation of the natives to the European way of life, albeit a second grade human beings. Therefore, education was perhaps one of the most potent tools for cultural Europeanization of indigenous peoples. There was no attempt on the part of the colonial government to even hide and stated goals of the colonial education, namely social engineering. Education was expressly employed to shape the political, social, cultural, and economic direction of the colonies and was designed to reinforce and reproduce racist structures. In short, it was an investment in a colonial future. There even exist recorded instances of the European legislators in the colonial South Africa exhorting to the South African government to win the fight against the non-white in the classroom instead of losing it in the battlefield. So much for all the wanted liberation and civilization being benevolently offered by the colonizer through his education. In Africa, even schools were not spared racial segregation, and it goes without saying that the schools meant for European students were better than those for African children. Expenditures, expenditures and budgetary outlay for the education of white students were generally 10 times higher than those for black students. Importantly, the goal of the social engineering and the subservience of the native society was embedded in the curriculum since the colonizer was aware of its power to shape the economic, social, and political future of the students. Clearly, any system of colonial education was but a way of maintaining political control over the production of knowledge and social discourse. While colonial education was offered as a means to climb the social ladder with acceptance by the European beings its ultimate destination, there were glass ceilings firmly in place which ensured that native students were always kept below the European. The colonial curriculum was often imported from either Britain or North America and was designed to produce Africans who would always consider themselves inferior in their interactions with Europeans and would take pride in serving the interests of the white man. It was formulated to prepare native children for taking up subordinate roles and to protect the interest of the colonizer at the expense of those of the colonized community. Impressionable young Africans were being taught that a civilized African was one who assimilated into European culture. Even teachers were trained in such a manner so as to ensure that African and European children in British colonies did not receive the same education. The entire stated goal of colonial education was to preserve and maintain the unquestioned superiority and supremacy of the whites, which has been summarized by scholars as follows: the brown workman would always have to work under a European, and therefore there would be no conflict. The cast of the mind of the native is such that he could rarely take charge. His lack of inventiveness and of ingenuity in mechanical work would made him inferior to the European as a trained workman, and at no time would he compete with the European. One scientific reason that was offered to explain the disparity in curricula was the colonizers' perception of a given colonized community's aptitude for knowledge based on race and pecking order being whites, Indians, colored, black Africans. The premise of this racial stratification was that Africans could not master bookish subjects and therefore, even if given an opportunity, were incapable of competing with Europeans. So, accordingly, they were offered only vocational and industrial training. On the rare occasion that exceptional African students were offered access to academic curriculum, the medium of instruction was English, and proficiency in which was integral to academic success. That said, even the academic curriculum would be centered on Europe and North America, which were portrayed as modern and developed. while African countries were shown as being traditional and backward. The policy of racial segregation was not limited to academics, but extended to extracurricular activities as well. Those sports with a higher earning potential, such as cricket, rugby, tennis, hockey, and polo, were reserved for white students, whereas soccer, netball, volleyball, track and field events were open to all, including the others. Commenting on the objective of colonial education in Africa, Nelson Mandela remarked thus: "The educated Englishman was our model, and we aspired to be were black Englishmen. We were taught and believed that the best ideas were English ideas, and the best government was English government, and the best men were Englishmen." So Mandela was acutely aware of the fact that the purpose of colonial education in educating people like him was to create a new black elite in Africa that looted up to the colonizer and his way of life. Clearly, as some scholars on the colonial education in Africa have pointed out, non European and European children in British colonies did not receive the same education, while one was taught to serve, the other to rule, which was the vision of the colonizer to colonize the colonized society. To assume that this goal was limited to the education introduced by colonial governments would be factually incorrect. In Africa, which was divided up between European colonizers such as Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, through 1884 Berlin Conference, education was taken up by missionaries, merchants, and colonial governments. Missionaries were much more candid than colonial governments about their objective of educating Africans. Evangelization literature reveals that the intent behind sending Christian missionaries to Native American societies too was the same. The transgenerational trauma inflicted by the Christian missionaries who accompanied the colonizer and who were responsible for running colonial schools was immeasurable. While some societies in Africa completely uh, succumbed to European education, others resisted and turned schools into the center of revolutionary protest, thereby birthing liberation movement. However, by and large, the overall impact of colonial education was that the colonized were left with a limited sense and of their past, and their indigenous traditions were gradually pushed towards extinction. To cut a long story short, colonial education annihilated a society's belief in itself. It made the colonized people see their past as a one vast wasteland of non-achievement. It made them desirous of distancing themselves from that wasteland and instead identify with an entire entity that was furthest removed from them. That is European culture. Not only did it push the colonized natives further away from their heritage, but it also undermined their self confidence at an individual level. All in all, this much is clear: European coloniality was directly responsible for disrupting the sacred relationship between indigenous people and nature. The destruction of their faith, language, political, societal structure, and knowledge, in short, their entire culture. This led to what the scholars have termed psychocultural marginality, wherein the loss of cultural identity results in social and individual disorganization, which manifest as low esteem, extreme poverty, oppression, depression, loss of identity, substance abuse, violence, lower life expectancy, low educational attainment, limited employment, poor housing, and ill health. It is a continuing state of limbo wherein the natives and their natives are neither capable of subscribing to the culture of the colonizer nor going back to their own roots, since they do not exist as a whole any longer. This transgenerational trauma is cumulative, unresolved, historic, and ongoing. As long as coloniality is alive and kicking, it was to the credit of determination of native peoples which kept alive whether remained of their culture. It was this determination that gave colonized societies the strength and confidence needed to aspire for political independence, which was also partly a consequence of colonial education backfiring on the colonizer. However, as we shall see in the next chapter, the deep entrenchment of the coloniality of the Christian European colonizer through the establishment of his potential legal and educational infrastructure impacted even the freedom struggles of colonized societies, so much so that their political aspiration, starting from the manner in which they defined freedom to the political institutions they hoped to set up after independence, including their vision for the decolonized society, were all influenced by the coloniality. While the impact of coloniality on freedom movements could not have been and was not uniform, there is no denying the fact that coloniality influenced them to varying degrees. As we shall see, the manifestation of secularized coloniality remains most rampant in the political, legal, and religious spheres, which reflects in the misplaced sense of pride that several decolonized nations draw as inheritors of a common law tradition, or being part of the commonwealth of civilized nation, or as the beneficiary of the Magna Carta. This includes internationalization of that most fundamental of European political conceptions, that is nation statehood and its attendant trapping. So this was the third chapter that of the this section one of the book. So we have covered three chapters, and this is the part four. And in the next part, I will try to cover the fourth chapter, but this is 45 pages long. So fourth chapter will be covered in two parts. So let's see and when we'll be able to finish this book. And I was also covering another book that is written by Dr. S Jaishankar, Side by Side. So this book is short. This can be covered in a while, in 2 or 3 weeks. So let us see when, at what time this book is finished. So we'll meet in the next video for the fourth chapter. Till then,